Revenge was her plan. But that fateful night with the billionaire, she couldn't pull the trigger, she cried. How could I fall in love with him? Hey family, I'm your host, Dr. Tom, and before we begin the story, kindly let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're just joining us for the first time, quickly hit that subscribe button too. Trust me, this story will challenge everything you think you know about love and revenge. Also, if you enjoy today's story, don't forget to like, comment, and share with your friends. Now, let's dive in. The rain fell steadily against the windows of Elara Wynn's cramped apartment in northeast Washington, D.C., each droplet carrying the weight of 3 years of grief and growing determination. At 28, she possessed the kind of fierce intelligence that had earned her a journalism degree from Georgetown on scholarships alone. But tonight her amber eyes held something darker, the burning focus of someone who had finally found her purpose in the ashes of tragedy. The manila folders spread across her second-hand desk contained 3 years of methodical investigation, each document a piece of the puzzle that had consumed her life since that terrible October night when everything changed. Her fingers traced the edges of a faded photograph tucked beside her laptop, her parents, David and Maria Wynn, smiling at a community barbecue just weeks before their deaths. David Wynn had been a labor organizer in Southeast D.C., a man whose weathered hands and determined heart had fought tirelessly for workers' rights in the industrial warehouses that dotted the Potomac. He'd spent 15 years challenging unsafe working conditions, wage theft, and the systematic exploitation of immigrant families who had nowhere else to turn. Maria, her mother, had been a social worker with the D.C. Department of Human Services, documenting the living conditions of families trapped in cycles of poverty and fear. They were getting close to something big, Elara whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible over the rain, something that scared the wrong people. The last conversation she'd had with her father played in her mind like a broken record. He had called her on a Tuesday evening, his voice tense with an excitement she'd never heard before. "Mija," David had said, using the Spanish endearment her mother had taught him despite his Irish roots. "We've found something. Maria and we've been documenting the conditions at those Voss subsidiary warehouses, and the connections go higher than we ever imagined." "What kind of connections, Papa?" "The kind that could bring down some very powerful people." "But Elara, if something happens to us, nothing's going to happen to you," she had interrupted, the naivety of her younger self painful to remember now. "Listen to me," David had insisted, his voice carrying a weight that made her stomach clench with dread. "Promise me something. If anything happens to your mother and me, don't let them bury the truth with our bodies. Promise me you'll finish what we started." 24 hours later, David and Maria Wynn were dead, their car wrapped around an oak tree on a stretch of Route 50 they had driven safely for 15 years. The police called it a tragic accident brake failure on a rainy night, the kind of thing that happened to older vehicles when maintenance got deferred due to financial constraints. But Elara knew better. She had seen the brake lines herself when she visited the impound lot, the clean cuts that spoke of sabotage rather than mechanical failure. She had tried to tell the investigating officers, but her concerns were dismissed as the desperate theories of a grieving daughter unable to accept a random tragedy. The insurance company had ruled it accidental death. The case was closed within weeks. The Wynn family's fight against corruption and exploitation died with them, or so everyone assumed. Everyone except their daughter. Standing in Arlington National Cemetery 3 years later, Elara stared down at the simple headstones that marked her parents' final resting place. The flowers she brought every month, daisies for her mother, who had loved their cheerful persistence, and roses for her father, who had always bought them for Maria on their anniversary, lay fresh against the granite. "I found them, Papa," she said quietly, her breath visible in the October chill. "The connections you and Mama died trying to expose. The Voss family empire isn't just built on political influence. It's built on the blood of people like the families you were trying to protect. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sounds of D.C. traffic and the lives continuing around this place of memory and loss. Senator Jonathan Voss and his son Damien have been using their political connections to facilitate labor trafficking for 3 decades. Immigrant families promised legitimate work, then trapped in conditions that amount to modern slavery. The warehouses where Papa organized, the social services Mama tried to reform, it's all connected to a network that generates millions in profits while destroying thousands of lives. Elara knelt beside the graves, her hands pressed against the cold earth that held the 2 people who had shaped her understanding of justice and compassion. I have the documents now: bank records, communication logs, testimony from survivors who were too scared to speak while you were alive. I'm going to publish everything, and when I do, the Voss dynasty is going to fall. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees, her jaw set with the determination that had sustained her through years of investigation. I won't let them bury the truth with your bodies. I promise. The headline that appeared in the Washington Herald on November 15th sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Blood money, the Voss dynasty's dark empire exposed. Elara's byline carried 6 months of meticulous research, documenting a network of corruption that stretched from Capitol Hill to the industrial districts where her parents had died trying to protect the vulnerable. 22 miles away in the exclusive enclave of Great Falls, Virginia, Damien Voss stood in his father's private study, his steel-gray eyes scanning the damning article with the cold calculation that had been beaten into him since childhood. At 32, he possessed the sharp intelligence and ruthless pragmatism that had made the Voss family untouchable for 3 generations. But the woman's investigation threatened to expose vulnerabilities that could destroy everything. Senator Jonathan Voss, a man whose political influence had shaped legislation for 4 decades, slammed the newspaper onto his mahogany desk with a force that made his son's jaw tighten imperceptibly. "This journalist," the senator snarled, his voice carrying the barely controlled fury of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. "This Wynn girl thinks she can destroy us?" Damien studied Elara's professional photograph, accompanying the article, fierce dark eyes that held unwavering determination, and something that looked like barely contained rage. Her investigation was thorough, damning, and unfortunately accurate in ways that suggested access to information that should have been buried with her parents. Her father was that labor organizer who was causing problems 3 years ago, Damien said quietly, his voice betraying nothing of the recognition that had clicked into place. "David Wynn. The accident took care of that problem?" Jonathan replied dismissively, his casual reference to murder delivered with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. "No one could prove anything then, and no one can prove anything now. Apparently his daughter thinks otherwise." Damien continued reading, his analytical mind cataloging each revelation and tracing the investigative pathways that had led Elara to information the family had thought safely concealed. "She's thorough, intelligent, and she has nothing left to lose. Then make sure she loses even that," Jonathan commanded, his pale eyes glittering with the cruel calculation that had made him one of the most feared men in Washington. "Use whatever resources you need. This ends now." Within 48 hours, Damien had set his plan in motion with the efficiency that had made him his father's most effective weapon. Using the family's extensive network of contacts in law enforcement, the judiciary, and the media, he began constructing a web of fabricated evidence designed to destroy Elara's credibility and eliminate her as a threat. Financial fraud allegations appeared in her bank records, suspicious transactions that suggested she had accepted payment for favorable coverage. Conspiracy charges were built around manufactured communications that implied she was working with foreign interests to destabilize American political institutions. Bribery accusations were supported by forged documents and paid testimonies from individuals whose loyalty could be purchased. The arrest came at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, designed for maximum humiliation and media impact. Elara was dragged from her apartment in handcuffs, while neighbors watched in shocked silence, the flashing cameras capturing every moment of her bewilderment and growing horror as she realized the magnitude of what was happening to her. Her newspaper, the Washington Herald, fired her within hours of the arrest. The editor who had championed her investigation suddenly unreachable and unavailable for comment. Her press credentials were revoked, her sources refused to return her calls, and her reputation was systematically destroyed across every media platform that had once celebrated her work. The trial was a masterclass in character assassination disguised as legal proceedings. Witnesses who had spoken to Elara during her investigation suddenly recanted their statements or claimed she had misrepresented their words. Evidence that had seemed ironclad was ruled inadmissible due to technicalities that appeared overnight. Her court-appointed attorney seemed more interested in managing her expectations than mounting a defense. Throughout the proceedings, Damien sat in the gallery with the detached composure of someone observing a chess match in which the outcome had already been determined. But during one particularly brutal cross-examination, when the prosecutor was painting Elara as a manipulative opportunist who had exploited grieving families for personal gain, her eyes found his across the crowded courtroom for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. They stared at each other, the daughter of the people he had killed, and the man who was now destroying her life with the same methodical precision his family had used to eliminate her parents. "You know exactly who I am," she mouthed silently, her dark eyes burning with a fury that made something uncomfortable shift in Damien's chest. "You know why I came for your family." He looked away, telling himself the strange tightness in his throat was satisfaction at a job well done. But that night, alone in his penthouse apartment, Damien found himself unable to forget the look in Elara Wynn's eyes, not just hatred, but a kind of devastated understanding that suggested she had expected nothing less from the world that had already taken everything she loved. The verdict was guilty on all charges. Elara Wynn, once one of Washington's most promising investigative journalists, was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, her career destroyed, her reputation in ruins, her parents' sacrifice seemingly meaningless in the face of the Voss family's unlimited resources and ruthless efficiency. The woman who entered Federal Correctional Institution Petersburg was not the same person who would eventually emerge 18 months later. Elara Wynn, idealistic journalist and daughter of murdered activists, died somewhere between her third month in solitary confinement and the day she realized that survival required becoming something harder, colder, and infinitely more calculating than her enemies. My family, before we continue, I noticed a lot of my viewers leave our story without subscribing, and honestly, I put a lot of efforts in creating these heartfelt stories. When you watch from the sidelines, it breaks my heart. Please encourage me by quickly hitting that subscribe button right now and share this story if you're already enjoying it. Now you've done that, let's continue. Prison became her university in ways that Georgetown never could have been. The law library became her war room, where she spent every available hour studying not just legal precedents and appeals processes, but the methodologies of justice and revenge that existed outside the boundaries of legitimate institutions. Fellow inmates became her professors in subjects that had never appeared in any curriculum: surveillance, identity creation, the psychology of deception, and the patient cultivation of trust before its complete betrayal. "You got heart, girl," said Patricia Donovan, a lifer who had been convicted of murdering her abusive husband after 20 years of systematic torture. "But heart ain't gonna get you what you need when you get out of here. You want to take down the people who put you in this cage. You better learn to think like them." Patricia became Elara's mentor in transformation, teaching her that justice wasn't something that happened in courtrooms or through official channels. It was something you took with your own hands when the system failed to protect the innocent. "They destroyed your life because you played by their rules," Patricia explained during one of their conversations in the prison yard. "You believed that truth and evidence and moral righteousness would be enough. But powerful people don't play by those rules, honey. They play to win, no matter what the cost. Month by month, Elara felt herself changing in ways that both terrified and empowered her. The naive belief in systemic justice was burned away by the reality of her circumstances, replaced by a cold understanding that the Voss family had destroyed her parents and her life because they could, and because no one with the power to stop them had been willing to intervene. She used every resource available to plan her revenge with methodical precision. Prison computers allowed her to research identity transformation techniques, plastic surgery procedures that could alter her appearance, and the underground networks that could provide new documentation for someone willing to pay the price. The prison library contained case studies of successful infiltrations, corporate espionage techniques, and psychological manipulation tactics that could be adapted for her purposes. But most importantly, she studied Damien Voss himself. Every article written about him, every public appearance, every interview and speech was analyzed for patterns of behavior, personal preferences, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited. She memorized his schedule, his business interests, his known associates, and his reputation for demanding excellence from the people who worked for him. By the time her release date approached, Elara had constructed a complete new identity for herself. Elena Walsh, a fictional woman with an impeccable educational background, professional experience in high-level administrative positions, and references that would pass even the most thorough background investigation. The surgery would come later, after her release, paid for with money she had managed to save and borrow from sources her old self would never have considered approaching. On the day she walked out of FCI Petersburg, Elara Wynne was effectively dead. The woman who took her first breath of free air was someone new, harder, smarter, and completely dedicated to a single purpose that would consume every aspect of her existence. Her first stop was Arlington National Cemetery, where she stood once again before her parents' graves. But this time, she wasn't the broken daughter seeking comfort from the dead. She was a weapon forged in the fires of injustice, tempered by months of planning, and sharpened by a hatred that had grown stronger rather than weaker during her imprisonment. "I failed you once," she whispered to the cold marble headstones. "I let him destroy me before I could destroy him. I believed in a system that was never designed to protect people like us." The wind carried the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sounds of a city that had moved on without her. But Elara felt none of the grief that had once overwhelmed her in this place. "But I'm stronger now. I understand how their world really works, and I know exactly how to make them pay for what they took from us. This time, I won't make the same mistake of believing in justice. This time, I'll become justice." 6 months later, a woman named Elena Walsh would apply for a position as personal assistant to Damien Voss, heir to the political dynasty that had murdered her parents and destroyed her life. But that transformation was still ahead of her, requiring months of physical alteration, psychological preparation, and the careful construction of a false identity that would pass even the most rigorous investigation. For now, Elara simply stood in the growing darkness, feeling the weight of her promise settling around her like armor. She had 18 months to prepare for war against an enemy who had no idea that their greatest victory had created their most dangerous opponent. The idealistic journalist was dead. In her place stood something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything she needed to win. 6 months after her release from prison, the woman who had once been Elara Wynne sat in the reception area of Voss Enterprises, her transformation so complete that even her own reflection sometimes startled her. The plastic surgery had been subtle but effective, reshaping her nose, altering her cheekbones, and changing the line of her jaw just enough to create a new face. Her naturally dark hair was now a professional honey blonde, styled in a way that suggested competence without drawing attention. Contact lenses had changed her amber eyes to a cool hazel that revealed nothing of the fire burning beneath. Elena Walsh's credentials were flawless, because Elara had spent months creating them with the same methodical precision she had once applied to investigative journalism. The fictional woman had graduated magna cum laude from Vanderbilt University with degrees in business administration and political science. Her work history showed progressive advancement through high-level administrative positions at consulting firms and nonprofit organizations, each reference carefully cultivated through the underground networks she had discovered during her incarceration. "Ms. Walsh?" The receptionist's voice was professionally warm. "Mr. Voss will see you now." Elara's pulse remained steady as she was escorted through the executive offices of the company that had profited from her parents' blood. She had practiced this moment countless times, preparing for every possible question, every potential recognition, every scenario that might expose her true identity. The hatred that had sustained her through 18 months of imprisonment was carefully locked away behind a mask of professional competence. Damien Voss stood as she entered his corner office, and for a moment that lasted an eternity, Elara stared at the man who had destroyed her life. He was taller than she had expected, his steel-gray eyes holding the kind of cold intelligence that had made him his father's most effective weapon. His handshake was firm, his smile professionally courteous, and his entire bearing suggested someone accustomed to commanding respect and obedience. "Ms. Walsh," Damien said, gesturing toward a chair across from his mahogany desk, "thank you for coming. Your qualifications are impressive." "Thank you, Mr. Voss," Elara replied, her voice steady and revealing nothing of the rage coursing through her veins. "I believe my experience makes me uniquely qualified for this position." "More qualified than you could possibly know," she thought, studying his face for any sign of recognition. But the careful alterations to her appearance had done their work. He looked at Elena Walsh and saw only a polished professional seeking employment. "Walk me through your background," Damien said, settling behind his desk with the casual authority of someone who had never doubted his right to judge others. "What draws you to this particular opportunity?" Elara launched into Elena Walsh's carefully constructed biography, each detail delivered with the confidence of someone whose entire life had been legitimate and above board. She spoke of her desire to work at the highest levels of political influence, her admiration for the Voss family's commitment to public service, and her belief that real change happened when dedicated professionals supported visionary leaders. Every word was a lie wrapped in just enough truth to be convincing. "The allegations that have been made about your family don't concern you?" Damien asked, his gray eyes sharp with the kind of assessment that had identified threats and eliminated them for 3 decades. "Every powerful family has enemies willing to spread rumors and fabrications," Elara replied with a slight smile that never reached her eyes. "I prefer to judge people by their accomplishments and their character, not by the jealous whispers of those who lack the courage to build something significant themselves." The response clearly pleased Damien, confirming his assessment of her as someone who understood the realities of power and wasn't naive enough to be swayed by media sensationalism. They discussed her salary expectations, her availability to travel, and her willingness to work the long hours that came with supporting someone at his level of responsibility. "One final question," Damien said as the interview drew to a close. "Why should I trust you with access to sensitive information and confidential operations?" Elara looked directly into his eyes, the eyes that had watched her destruction with cold satisfaction and delivered her most carefully crafted lie. "Because loyalty is the foundation of every successful professional relationship, Mr. Voss. When I commit to supporting someone, that commitment is absolute. You'll never have reason to question my dedication to your success." Within 24 hours, Elena Walsh was hired as Damien Voss's personal assistant, with access to his schedule, his communications, and the inner workings of an empire built on corruption and murder. Her first day began with a comprehensive security briefing and the installation of monitoring software on her work devices, precautions that amused rather than concerned her, since she had anticipated such measures and prepared accordingly. Working as Damien's personal assistant provided Elara with access to a level of operational detail that surpassed her wildest expectations. Every phone call she screened, every document she filed, Every meeting she attended gave her another piece of the evidence she was methodically compiling for his eventual destruction. The Voss family empire was even more extensive and ruthless than her original investigation had revealed. Shell companies funneled profits from human trafficking operations through legitimate businesses. Political donations bought influence that was immediately leveraged to block investigations and intimidate whistleblowers. The network of corruption extended into federal agencies, state governments, and international organizations that were supposed to combat the exact crimes the family was committing. Elara's days were spent managing Damien's schedule with flawless efficiency, while secretly documenting every aspect of his criminal enterprise. She installed recording devices in his office, copied files to encrypted drives, and photographed documents that would eventually form the foundation of cases against dozens of complicit officials and business partners. Every act of service was simultaneously an act of sabotage, every moment of apparent loyalty a step toward his complete downfall. But something she hadn't anticipated began to complicate her carefully constructed hatred. Glimpses of the man beneath the monster that made her revenge more psychologically complex than she had prepared for. Late one evening, as she organized files in his private office, Elara witnessed a phone conversation that revealed cracks in Damien's carefully controlled facade. Senator Jonathan Voss was calling to discuss his son's performance during recent negotiations with congressional leaders, and his tone carried the kind of casual cruelty that had shaped Damien's entire childhood. "You were weak today." The senator's voice carried clearly through the speakerphone, weak and unfocused. "Our associates are beginning to question whether you have the strength to carry this family's legacy forward." Damien's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "The negotiations achieved exactly what we needed, Father. The transportation bill will pass with our amendments intact." "Barely. And at what cost? You showed too much concern for public opinion, too much hesitation when decisive action was required. I didn't raise you to be soft, Damien. I raised you to be effective." After the call ended, Elara watched Damien sit in silence for several minutes, his hands pressed against his temples as if trying to push away pain that went deeper than any headache. The vulnerability in his posture was so unexpected that she felt an unwelcome flicker of something that might have been sympathy. She quickly suppressed the feeling, reminding herself that this was the man who had killed her parents and destroyed her life. His childhood trauma didn't excuse his adult crimes, and his father's abuse didn't absolve him of the choice to continue the family's bloody legacy. But over the following weeks, she continued to witness moments that complicated her understanding of who Damien Voss really was. His genuine concern when a staff member's daughter was hospitalized, the way he stayed late to personally review legislation that would affect working families, despite having no political obligation to care about its impact. The exhaustion that settled over him after particularly brutal meetings with his father, and the way he seemed to carry the weight of expectations that would have crushed someone with less inner strength. "Elena," he said one evening as they worked alone preparing for a congressional hearing, "do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had made completely different choices?" The question caught her off guard, both because of its unexpectedness and because of the note of genuine curiosity in his voice. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully, maintaining her professional tone while her heart raced with the implications of the conversation. "I mean a life where your path wasn't determined by other people's expectations or demands, where you could choose what mattered to you instead of what was required of you." Elara studied his profile as he stared out at the Washington skyline, seeing something in his expression that looked almost like longing. For a moment, she glimpsed the boy who might have existed before his father's brutality shaped him into a weapon of political ambition. "I think most people wonder about the roads they didn't take," she said, choosing her words with extreme care. "But ultimately, we become who we choose to be, regardless of where we started." "Do we?" Damien turned to look at her, his gray eyes holding a depth of questioning that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "Or do we just become who we were always going to become, given the circumstances that shaped us?" The philosophical weight of the conversation was dangerous territory for someone whose entire purpose was his destruction. Elara felt herself balanced on the edge of a precipice she hadn't seen, approaching the possibility that understanding her enemy might make destroying him infinitely more difficult. "I believe in choice," she said finally, meaning it more than she wanted to admit. "I have to believe that we're more than the sum of what others tried to make us." 3 months into her employment, Elara began the systematic release of information that would gradually erode the foundation of everything Damien had built. Each leak was carefully planned and strategically timed to appear as though it came from different sources: a disgruntled accountant here, a vengeful former business partner there. The cumulative effect was devastating, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust within the Voss organization that served her purposes perfectly. The first major revelation appeared in the New York Times. Detailed financial records showing how Voss Enterprises had used political connections to secure government contracts while systematically underpaying immigrant workers. The story was picked up by international news outlets and human rights organizations, generating the kind of sustained negative coverage that had previously been impossible to achieve against the family's media control. Damien's response was swift and characteristically thorough. He implemented additional security measures, conducted loyalty investigations of all senior staff members, and hired a private investigation firm to identify the source of the leaks. But Elena Walsh appeared above suspicion. Her background was spotless, her loyalty apparent, and her access to information seemed limited to administrative tasks that wouldn't have provided the kind of detailed intelligence appearing in the media. "Someone very close to us is betraying the family," Damien told her one evening as they worked late in his private study. The stress was visible in the tight lines around his eyes, the way his hands clenched when he thought no one was watching. Elara maintained her expression of professional concern while mentally cataloging his psychological state for future exploitation. This was exactly the effect she had hoped to achieve. His confidence eroded from within, his ability to trust compromised by the constant threat of exposure. "Do you have any theories about who it might be?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the satisfaction burning in her chest. "Several," Damien replied, his voice rough with exhaustion and controlled fury. "But theories aren't enough. I need concrete evidence before I can take action." The irony was exquisite. He was asking her to help identify the person who was systematically destroying him, never suspecting that his most trusted assistant was the architect of his downfall. But even as Elara reveled in the success of her strategy, something unexpected was happening that threatened to undermine her carefully maintained emotional distance. Working so closely with Damien meant witnessing not just his ruthlessness, but also moments of genuine humanity that complicated her hatred in ways she hadn't anticipated. She watched him personally review the healthcare benefits for all company employees, ensuring that families would be protected even when it cost the company additional profits. She saw his reaction when news broke about a factory accident that had injured several workers, not the calculated concern of someone managing public relations, but genuine distress about human suffering. She witnessed his private moments of doubt and exhaustion, when the mask of confident authority slipped just enough to reveal the man carrying burdens that no one else could fully understand. "It must be incredibly isolating," she found herself saying one evening, meaning to probe his psychological vulnerabilities but hearing genuine empathy in her own voice, "never knowing who you can truly rely on." Damien looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Despite her determination to remain professionally detached, "Are you someone I can rely on, Elena?" The question hung between them like a challenge, loaded with implications that went far beyond their professional relationship. Elara met his gaze steadily, her mind racing with the cruel irony of the moment he was asking for loyalty from the person whose entire purpose was his destruction. "Always," she said, the lie sliding easily off her tongue, while something deeper twisted uncomfortably in her chest. As autumn turned toward winter, the leaks continued with increasing frequency and sophistication. Congressional investigations were launched, Federal agencies began reviewing contracts, and international monitoring organizations started paying attention to patterns they had previously overlooked. The Voss empire was beginning to crumble from within, exactly as Elara had planned, but Damien's growing dependence on Elena Walsh was becoming a complication she hadn't fully anticipated. He had begun confiding in her about matters that went far beyond professional concerns, sharing doubts and fears that revealed the psychological cost of carrying his family's legacy of corruption and violence. "You know what the strangest thing is?" he said one night as they worked alone in his office, preparing for testimony before a congressional subcommittee. "In this entire organization, with all these people whose livelihoods depend on my success, you're the only person I trust, completely." The words hit Elara like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because she could hear the genuine vulnerability beneath them. This man who commanded billion-dollar empires and influenced global politics was confessing that his most trusted advisor was someone whose entire identity was a lie created for his destruction. "Trust is rare in your position," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the chaos in her thoughts. "It makes sense that you would value it when you find it." "It's not just that you're trustworthy," Damien continued, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "It's that you understand the weight of responsibility without judging the decisions it requires. You see the complexity of leadership without demanding simple answers to impossible questions." Elara felt something dangerous shifting inside her chest, an unwelcome recognition that the man she was methodically destroying was also someone capable of inspiring genuine loyalty and affection. The realization terrified her because it threatened the foundation of hatred that had sustained her through prison and guided her through months of careful planning. She was falling into the trap she had never seen coming, beginning to care about her enemy, even as she engineered his complete annihilation. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Damien's life into before and after. Senator Marcus Voss, the Iron Patriarch who had built an empire on blood money and political maneuvering, collapsed in his study while reviewing campaign strategy documents. The massive heart attack claimed him before the paramedics could even reach the estate. Elara watched the breaking news from her apartment, coffee growing cold in her hands as footage of ambulances and police cars filled her screen. She should have felt victorious, one less corrupt politician poisoning the system. Instead, an unexpected hollow ache settled in her chest as she saw Damien emerge from the mansion, his face a mask of barely controlled devastation. For 48 hours, she observed his grief from a distance, through news coverage and social media. The man who had always carried himself with predatory confidence now moved like someone walking through quicksand. His shoulders, once squared with arrogance, now curved inward as if protecting a wound. The realization that she cared about his pain terrified her more than any threat he'd ever made. The funeral was a spectacle of political theater. Every corrupt senator, every bought judge, every dirty businessman who had ever shaken hands with Marcus Voss came to pay their respects. Elara positioned herself across the street from the cathedral, telephoto lens capturing faces for her ever-growing files of corruption, but her camera kept drifting back to Damien. He stood at the graveside like a statue carved from grief, accepting condolences with mechanical politeness. When his mother collapsed during the service, he caught her with gentle hands that Elara had never seen him use. The vulnerability in his face as he held his weeping mother struck something deep in Elara's chest, a recognition of loss that transcended their war. 3 days after burying his father, Damien called a press conference. Elara positioned herself in the back of the room, press badge hanging from her neck, watching as he approached the podium with renewed purpose. His grief had crystallized into something harder, more dangerous. "My father believed in the American dream," he began, his voice carrying the weight of fresh loss. "He believed that strong leadership could guide this nation through any crisis. Today, I announce my candidacy for President of the United States. I will honor his legacy by fighting for every American who feels forgotten by the system." The room erupted in questions, flashbulbs creating a strobe effect that made everything feel surreal. Elara felt the walls of her carefully constructed world shifting. A grieving son seeking power was far more dangerous than a simple criminal. Sympathy made people stupid, and grief made politicians untouchable. As the press conference ended, Damien's eyes found hers across the crowded room. For a moment, the world fell away, and she saw past his public mask to the raw pain underneath. Her breath caught as she recognized something that made her blood run cold. He wasn't just performing grief for the cameras. His anguish was real, and it was transforming him into something she might not be able to destroy. That night, he appeared at her apartment door without warning. She opened it to find him standing in the hallway, still wearing his funeral suit but with his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. The careful composure he'd maintained all week had finally cracked. "I don't know why I came here," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. She should have slammed the door, should have called security. Instead, she stepped aside and let him enter her sanctuary, the same space where she'd planned his destruction for months. He walked to her windows overlooking the city, pressing his palms against the glass like a caged animal seeking escape. "He was supposed to see me win," Damien said quietly. "Everything I did, every choice I made, it was all to make him proud. And now..." The sentence hung unfinished between them. Elara remained by the door, afraid to move closer, afraid of what she might do if she saw tears in those calculating eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. He turned from the window, and she saw that his careful mask had completely fallen away. This wasn't the predator who had threatened her career, or the politician who manipulated crowds. This was just a son who had lost his father, seeking comfort from the only person who didn't want anything from him. "Because you're the only one who doesn't need me to be strong," he said simply. The realization crept over Elara like a slow poison, seeping into her consciousness, despite every defense she'd built. Somewhere between his midnight visits and their careful conversations, somewhere between watching him grieve and seeing glimpses of the man beneath the monster, she had committed the ultimate betrayal. She was falling in love with Damien Voss. The admission made her physically ill. She spent an entire day in her bathroom, retching as her body rejected this emotional treason. How could she love the man she was destroying? How could she feel tenderness toward hands stained with blood? How could her heart recognize home in the arms of her enemy? My family, before we continue, I noticed a lot of my viewers leave our story without subscribing, and honestly, I put a lot of efforts in creating these heartfelt stories. Please encourage me by quickly hitting that subscribe button right now and share this story if you're already enjoying it. Now, let's continue. For weeks, she waged war against her own feelings. She reminded herself of his father's crimes, of the lives destroyed by Voss money, of the justice she owed to the dead. But every time Damien looked at her with those increasingly unguarded eyes, her resolve crumbled a little more. He had begun staying later during his visits, finding excuses to extend their conversations. They talked about everything except the obvious: his campaign, her work, the investigation that was slowly tightening around his organization. Instead, they discussed books, childhood memories, dreams they'd harbored before ambition and revenge consumed them. "Did you always want to be a journalist?" he asked one evening, settling into the chair across from her kitchen table as if he belonged there. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "I thought I could save the world one student at a time." What changed? The answer was complex: her father's murder, her mother's descent into alcoholism, the system that had failed them both. But sitting across from the son of her father's killer, she couldn't voice those truths. "The world needed different kinds of saving," she said instead. He nodded, understanding flickering in his expression. "I wanted to be a veterinarian. Can you believe that? All I ever wanted was to heal things." The image of young Damien tending to injured animals was so at odds with the man before her that it made her chest ache. What had they both become in their pursuit of justice and power? 3 weeks into this dangerous intimacy, he arrived at her door carrying takeout from the Thai restaurant they'd discovered together. She was sitting on her couch in an old sweater, hair pulled back, no makeup, the most vulnerable she'd ever let him see her. As he settled beside her with their dinner, the domesticity of the moment struck her like a physical blow. This was what love felt like, she realized with horror. Not the desperate passion of her college relationships or the careful affection she'd felt for safe men. This was the kind of love that rewrote your DNA, that made you capable of impossible forgiveness, that turned traitors into saints and enemies into saviors. "Elara," Damien said softly, setting down his untouched food. She looked up to find him studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse race. "I need to tell you something." Terror and anticipation warred in her chest. "What?" "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung between them like a confession at an altar. She watched his face, searching for manipulation or calculation, but found only raw honesty. The careful politician had vanished, leaving behind a man as terrified and amazed by love as she was. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I know." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it despite knowing she should pull away. "I know it makes no sense. I know the timing is insane. I know you probably think I think I'm falling in love with you too," she interrupted, the words tearing from her throat like a scream. The confession shattered something vital inside her chest. She began to cry great, ugly sobs that came from the deepest part of her soul. He pulled her against him, and she let herself collapse into his arms, breathing in the scent of his cologne mixed with grief and desperation. "God help us both," she whispered against his chest. They held each other as the city sparkled beyond her windows, two people caught in a love story that could only end in destruction. She knew she should confess everything, the investigation, the evidence, the role she'd played in his coming downfall. But wrapped in his arms, she was nothing but a woman in love. And women in love were capable of infinite self-deception. That night, for the first time since this war began, Elara fell asleep in the arms of her enemy and dreamed of a world where love could conquer justice, where hearts could overrule history, where two broken people might actually save each other. She woke knowing it was all a beautiful lie. The FBI task force moved with surgical precision, their months of preparation finally paying off. Agent Rebecca Torres led the pre-dawn raid on Voss Enterprises, armed with warrants based on the evidence Elara had carefully leaked over the past 6 months. The financial records, the encrypted communications, the paper trail of blood money, all of it now in the hands of federal investigators. Elara watched the news coverage from her office, phone pressed to her ear as Detective Morrison provided real-time updates from his contacts in the bureau. "They've got bank records going back 15 years. Morrison said, his voice tight with excitement. "Money laundering, tax evasion, racketeering, the works. This is it, kid. We finally got the bastards." But Elara felt no triumph as she watched footage of agents carrying boxes from the building where Damien had inherited his father's empire. Instead, nausea twisted her stomach as she realized what she had set in motion. The man she loved was about to lose everything, and she was the architect of his destruction. Her phone buzzed with a text from Damien. "Emergency board meeting. Can't make dinner tonight. Rain check?" She stared at the message, knowing it might be the last normal communication between them. In a few hours, his world would collapse, and he would know that someone in his inner circle had betrayed him. The thought of his pain made her hands shake. The arrest came at 2:17 p.m. on a Thursday. Elara was in a coffee shop 6 blocks from Voss Enterprises when her phone exploded with news alerts. Video footage showed Damien being led from the building in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and rage. The presidential candidate who had been leading in early polls was now a defendant in a federal corruption case. She rushed home and spent the afternoon pacing her apartment, waiting for news of his bail hearing. When he was released 8 hours later, she was standing across from the courthouse, watching him emerge with his legal team. Their eyes met across the street, and something cold and assessing flickered in his gaze before he looked away. That night, he didn't come to her apartment, or the next night. For 3 days, Elara lived in a state of suspended terror, knowing that his silence meant he was investigating, searching for the traitor who had handed his life to the FBI. On the 4th night, he appeared at her door. She opened it to find him leaning against her doorframe, exhaustion and suspicion warring in his features. He was still beautiful, would always be beautiful to her now, but something fundamental had changed. The grief-stricken son who had sought comfort in her arms was gone, replaced by a man who had been betrayed and was hunting for answers. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. She stepped aside, and he entered her apartment like he was walking into a crime scene. His eyes swept over familiar details: the couch where they'd shared meals, the window where they'd talked until dawn, the kitchen table where they'd played cards and pretended they weren't falling in love. "Someone in my organization fed information to the FBI," he said without preamble. "Someone with access to my father's private files. Someone who knew about offshore accounts that only a handful of people could access." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face neutral. "Do you have any suspects?" "Several." He moved to her bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines with practiced casualness. "My head of security thinks it's someone from the finance department. My lawyer suspects a disgruntled former employee. My campaign manager believes it's political sabotage. What do you think?" He turned to face her, and she saw the moment when his mask finally slipped. Behind the careful politician's facade was a man in agony, someone who had lost everything and was now questioning everyone he'd ever trusted. "I think," he said slowly, "that whoever did this got close to me, close enough to access information, close enough to learn my routines, close enough to—" He paused, his voice catching slightly, "close enough to make me trust them completely." The implication hung between them like a sword. Elara forced herself to meet his eyes, even as her world tilted on its axis. "Damien," she whispered. "I need your help," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I need someone I can trust absolutely, someone outside my organization who can help me figure out who's destroying everything my family built." The cruel irony of his request hit her like a physical blow. He was asking his destroyer to help him find his destroyer. He was turning to his enemy for salvation, trusting the wolf to guard the sheep, begging the poison to become the antidote. "Of course," she heard herself say. "Whatever you need." Relief flooded his features, and he crossed the room to pull her into his arms. She let herself melt against him, breathing in his familiar scent while her heart shattered into smaller and smaller pieces. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "I don't know what I'd do without you." As he held her close, Elara closed her eyes and tried to memorize the feeling of being in his arms. Soon, very soon, he would know the truth. He would know that the woman he loved was the weapon that had destroyed him. He would know that every kiss had been a betrayal, every gentle touch a dagger in his back. But for this moment, in the eye of the storm she had created, she let herself pretend they were just two people in love, facing the world together. She let herself pretend that love could conquer justice, that hearts could overrule history, that there might still be a way to save them both. Even though she knew it was already far too late. The second arrest came 6 months later, and this time there would be no bail, no reprieve, no last-minute political maneuvering. Federal agents surrounded Damien's campaign headquarters at dawn, their warrant thick with additional charges built on evidence that kept materializing from anonymous sources. Elara watched from her car across the street as they led him away in chains, his presidential dreams dying in the harsh glare of television cameras. She had continued feeding information to the FBI throughout those 6 months of deception, each leak another nail in his coffin. Bank records from Switzerland, audio recordings of meetings with known criminals, financial documents linking the Voss family to 3 decades of organized crime. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, and entirely her creation. The trial began on a cold January morning that felt like the end of the world. United States v. Damien Voss dominated every news cycle, every front page, every conversation in the city. The prosecution painted him as the heir to a criminal empire, a man who had used his father's blood money to buy judges, silence witnesses, and corrupt the political process from within. Elara attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the back row of the gallery with her press credentials and a notebook she rarely used. She told herself she was there as a journalist, documenting the fall of a political dynasty. The truth was simpler and more devastating. She couldn't stay away from him, even as she watched her evidence destroy his life piece by piece. He looked different in the defendant's chair. The expensive suits had been replaced with standard courtroom attire. His hair, once perfectly styled, now showed threads of premature gray, but his posture remained straight, his expression calm, as if he had accepted his fate with the same grace his father had shown during his own scandals. On the seventh day of testimony, FBI agent Rebecca Torres took the stand. She methodically presented the financial evidence that would seal Damien's fate: bank statements, wire transfers, coded communications that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning decades. Each document was a dagger Elara had placed in the prosecution's hands. "Agent Torres," the prosecutor said, holding up a folder thick with papers, "can you explain to the jury how this evidence came to the attention of federal investigators? We received anonymous tips over a period of 18 months. Torres replied. "Someone with intimate knowledge of the defendant's operations provided us with documents and recordings that formed the foundation of our investigation." Elara's hands trembled as she gripped her pen. She felt exposed, as if everyone in the courtroom could see the guilt written across her face. But when she looked toward the defendant's table, she found Damien's eyes on her. Not accusatory or angry, but thoughtful, as if he was solving a puzzle he'd been working on for months. The moment stretched between them across the crowded courtroom. His lawyers were whispering urgently in his ear, but his attention remained fixed on her face. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, understanding dawned in his expression. She watched the exact second when he realized who had destroyed him. Instead of rage or betrayal, his face showed something that made her chest constrict with pain, a gentle sadness, tinged with what looked almost like relief, as if finally knowing the truth had lifted a weight he'd been carrying. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They proved that Damien had inherited not just his father's business empire, but his criminal enterprises. They showed how Voss money had influenced elections, bought judicial decisions, and silenced investigators for 30 years. They demonstrated that the grieving son who had run for president was, in fact, the operational head of one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in the country. Damien's defense team fought valiantly, arguing that he had been trying to legitimize his father's business interests, that he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. They painted him as a man trying to escape his family's legacy, not perpetuate it. But the evidence was too overwhelming, too detailed, too perfectly documented to dismiss. On the 14th day, the prosecution played their final card, a recorded phone conversation between Damien and a known money launderer, discussing the transfer of funds through offshore accounts. Elara had provided that recording 6 months earlier, captured during one of their intimate dinners, when he'd stepped away to take what he'd called an urgent business call. She had betrayed even their private moments, turning their love into evidence for his prosecution. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. "Guilty on all counts." The words echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Elara watched Damien's shoulders set as the verdict was read, his face betraying no emotion, even as his life shattered around him. His mother collapsed in the gallery, her sobs cutting through the formal proceedings like a knife. His lawyers immediately began discussing appeals, but everyone knew it was over. At sentencing 2 weeks later, Judge Patricia Hawthorne showed no mercy. The crimes were too extensive, the damage too severe, the pattern of corruption too entrenched to warrant anything less than the full weight of justice. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute judgment, "you have been found guilty of racketeering, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges that span 3 decades. Your family's criminal enterprise has corrupted our political system, perverted justice, and caused immeasurable harm to this community." Elara held her breath as the judge continued. "Therefore, I sentence you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to file their stories, family members wept, and lawyers immediately began planning appeals they knew were futile. But Elara heard none of it. All she could see was Damien, standing perfectly still as his future vanished, his dreams died, and his freedom ended forever. As the marshals approached to lead him away, he turned one last time toward the gallery. His eyes found hers across the crowded room, and for a moment they were the only two people in the world. He smiled then, not the predatory grin she'd first known, or the broken expression of recent months, but something gentle and understanding and heartbreakingly kind. It was the smile of a man who had figured out the puzzle completely, who knew exactly who had destroyed him and why, and who bore no anger for the woman who had chosen justice over love. It was forgiveness without words, understanding without explanation, love without condition. Then the marshals were leading him away, and Elara was left staring at empty space where the man she loved had stood moments before, knowing she would never see him as a free man again. The first text came 3 days after sentencing, sent from a contraband phone that would be discovered and confiscated within hours. Elara was sitting in her apartment, staring at the city lights and wondering how victory could feel so much like devastation, when her phone buzzed. "Damien, I know who you are." Her hands shook as she read the message. She'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it, knowing it was inevitable. The reckoning she'd avoided in the courtroom had finally arrived in 4 simple words. "Elara, I'm sorry." The response came immediately, as if he'd been waiting by his phone. "Damien, don't be. I deserved everything you gave me." She stared at the screen through tears she hadn't realized were falling. This wasn't the conversation she'd expected. Where was the rage, the accusations, the promises of revenge? "Elara, you trusted me completely." "Damien, I did, and you were right to betray that trust." The simple acceptance in his words broke something inside her chest. She had prepared herself for his hatred, had steeled herself against his anger. She had never considered that he might understand why she'd destroyed him. "Elara, your father killed mine, Detective James Crawford, 15 years ago." She sent the message before she could lose her courage, finally giving him the truth she'd hidden behind carefully constructed lies. The response took longer this time, and she could almost see him processing this final piece of the puzzle. "Damien, the honest cop who wouldn't take money. I remember him from the files. He was investigating our operations. Elara, he died because he wouldn't be bought. Damien, and his daughter grew up planning revenge." It wasn't a question. He had figured it out completely now, not just who she was, but why she was. What had driven her to infiltrate his life and methodically dismantle everything his family had built. "Elara, I spent 15 years planning your destruction." "Damien, how long did it take you to fall in love with me?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She set the phone down, pressing her hands to her face as sobs racked her body. This was the cruelest part of their story, not just that she had destroyed the man she loved, but that he knew exactly how much it had cost her to do it. "Elara, I fell in love with you anyway, and I hate myself for it." "Damien, don't hate yourself for loving. It's the only good thing either of us ever created." She read the message through blurred vision, her heart breaking completely, even facing life in prison, even knowing she was the architect of his downfall. He was trying to comfort her. The man she'd painted as a monster was showing her a grace she didn't deserve. "Elara, I watched you grieve your father. I held you while you cried, and I used all of it against you. Damien, you gave me the only real love I've ever known. That matters more than the rest. Elara, how can you forgive me?" "Damien, because you chose justice over love. Because you did what was right, even when it destroyed you." Because you're the person I never learned how to be." The phone screen blurred completely as tears streamed down her face. She had expected him to curse her name, to promise vengeance from behind bars. Instead, he was absolving her of sins she would carry forever. "Elara, I'm so sorry, Damien." "Damien, I'm not. You gave my life meaning at the end. You showed me what it felt like to be worthy of someone's love, even if I wasn't worthy of their mercy. Elara, I love you. God help me. I love you still." "Damien, I love you too. That's the only thing in this whole mess I'm not sorry for." The conversation continued sporadically over the next 2 hours, each message a small knife in her chest. He told her about the federal prison where he'd be transferred, about the appeals his lawyers were filing that they both knew were hopeless, about the books he planned to read in the decades stretching before him. She told him about the promotion she'd been offered at the paper, about the book deal publishers were offering for her story, about the life she would build in the shadow of his destruction. "Damien, write the book. Tell the truth about all of it. Someone should know that love was possible, even in the middle of this war. Elara, I can't profit from destroying you. Damien, you can honor what we had by making sure it meant something. Promise me." "Elara, I promise." Their final exchange came near midnight, when the contraband phone was probably minutes away from discovery. "Damien, thank you for loving me, even while you were destroying me. It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done. Elara, thank you for making me believe in love, even while I was choosing revenge. I'll carry it forever." "Damien, forever is all we have now." The phone went silent after that, and Elara knew the guards had found it. She sat in her empty apartment until dawn, holding her phone and reading their final conversation over and over, memorizing every word of their goodbye. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 4 months after Damien's sentencing. Elara was in her office at the paper, working on a follow-up story about political corruption reform, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Crawford, this is Warden Richardson at Federal Correctional Institution, Coleman. I'm calling regarding Damien Voss." Her blood turned to ice. "What happened?" "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Voss was found deceased in his cell this morning. It appears to be suicide. He left specific instructions that you be notified immediately." The phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering to the floor as the world tilted sideways. Suicide. The word echoed in her mind like a death knell, carrying with it the weight of everything she'd done, everything she'd destroyed, everything she'd lost. She made the drive to Florida in a fog of grief and guilt that threatened to suffocate her. The warden, a kind woman with sympathetic eyes, met her in a sterile office that smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. "He didn't suffer," Warden Richardson said gently. "The medical examiner confirmed it was quick. He left these for you." She placed a manila envelope on the desk between them, along with a sealed letter bearing Elara's name in Damien's careful handwriting. With shaking hands, Elara opened the envelope first. Inside were legal documents, property deeds, bank statements, all bearing her name as the new owner. The beach house, where his father had planned political strategies. The downtown office building that had housed 3 generations of Voss enterprises. Investment accounts worth millions of dollars. All of it legally transferred to her in the days before his death. "I don't understand," she whispered. "He spent his final weeks liquidating his assets and transferring everything to you," the warden explained. "His lawyers said he was very specific about his wishes. All legitimate holdings, nothing connected to the criminal enterprises. He wanted to ensure you received only clean money." Elara's hands trembled as she opened his final letter. "My dearest Elara, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Please don't blame yourself for this choice. It was mine alone, made with a clear mind and a peaceful heart. I've spent the last 4 months in a cell thinking about our story, about love and justice and the prices we pay for both. You chose justice over love, and I understand why. But I realized I could choose love over everything else. One final time. I'm giving you everything I have left. Use it for good. Build something beautiful on the ruins of what my family destroyed. Be the person I never learned how to be. There's a trust fund I've established for the families of everyone my father hurt, including yours. Detective Crawford's widow will be taken care of, and his daughter will have the resources to keep fighting for justice. Consider it my father's final payment, delivered through the only honest person in our story. I need you to know that loving you was the only pure thing I ever did. In a life built on corruption and compromise, you were my glimpse of what goodness looked like. Even as you destroyed me, you saved me from becoming the man I was meant to be. Don't mourn for me. I was never going to find redemption behind bars. But in loving you, in being loved by you, I found something worth more than freedom. I found grace. Live well, my love. Write our story. Show the world that love is possible anywhere, even between enemies, even in the middle of war, even when justice demands the highest price. Forever yours, Damien. P.S. There's one more thing in your safety deposit box at First National. Box 1247. The key is with my lawyer. Consider it my final gift to the woman who gave me the only happiness I ever knew. Elara read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated her shock. He had planned this final act with the same meticulous care he'd once applied to campaign strategy. Every detail considered, every loose end tied up, every gesture designed to transform his death into something meaningful. 2 days later, she stood in the bank vault, holding a small wooden box that contained the last surprise Damien Voss would ever give her. Inside, nestled in velvet, was an engagement ring, not the ostentatious display of wealth she might have expected, but a simple band with a single, perfect diamond that caught the fluorescent light and threw rainbows across the vault walls. Tucked beneath the ring was a final note, just a few lines in his familiar handwriting: for the life we never got to have, for the woman who taught me how to love without conditions, for the future where justice and mercy might have found a way to coexist. Wear it if you want to remember that love is stronger than revenge, that grace is more powerful than justice, that 2 broken people found something beautiful in the middle of destroying each other. All my love, always. Elara slipped the ring onto her right hand and felt its weight settle against her finger, like a promise, like a blessing, like a goodbye that would last forever. She walked out of the bank and into the afternoon sunlight, carrying his final gifts and the weight of a love story that had ended the only way it could, with sacrifice, with grace, with the understanding that some kinds of love are too big for the world to contain. That night, she began writing their story, keeping her promise to show the world that love was possible anywhere, even between enemies, even when justice demanded everything they had to give. The book would become a bestseller, the money funding a foundation that helped families of crime victims rebuild their lives. But the real victory wasn't in the sales or the success, it was in transforming their tragedy into something that served others, in building beauty from the ashes of their war. It was in proving that Damien had been right. Love was the only good thing they had created together, and it was strong enough to survive even death, even justice, even the weight of a victory that felt like defeat. Forever, as he had promised, was all they had. But forever, she learned, was enough. The law offices of Patterson T. Associates felt like a mausoleum as Elara signed the final documents that would transfer every penny of Damien's inheritance to charity, orphanages across 3 states, scholarship funds for children of murdered police officers, legal aid societies fighting corruption, food banks serving the communities his family had destroyed. "Are you certain about this, Ms. Crawford?" Attorney Patricia Patterson asked, her voice tinged with professional concern. "This represents approximately $47 million in assets. Perhaps you should take more time to consider." "I'm certain," Elara interrupted, her pen moving across the signature lines with mechanical precision. "Every dollar of it needs to go where it can do good, where it can heal instead of harm." she kept only enough to pay for 2 final expenses: a proper headstone for Damien's unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, and the small vial of pills she'd obtained from a veterinarian friend under the pretense of ending a suffering animal's pain. The irony wasn't lost on her. Damien had once dreamed of being a veterinarian, of healing injured creatures. Now his memory would help her end her own suffering, with the same mercy she might show a wounded bird. The paperwork took 3 hours to complete. When it was finished, Elara walked out of the law office carrying nothing but her purse and the weight of absolute emptiness. The city bustled around her, people rushing to meetings, lovers holding hands, children laughing as they chased pigeons, but she moved through it all like a ghost, untouchable and untouched. She drove to Oakwood Cemetery as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded her of the evenings she'd spent with Damien on her apartment balcony. The irony of choosing such a beautiful day to die wasn't lost on her, but she had learned that life's cruelest moments often came wrapped in beauty. Her parents' graves lay side by side beneath an old oak tree, their headstones weathered but dignified. James Crawford, devoted husband and father, who had died because he wouldn't compromise his principles. Helen Crawford, beloved wife and mother, who had died because she couldn't live without the man who had been her whole world. Elara knelt between the graves, pressing her palms against the cool marble, as if she could somehow transmit her apology through stone and earth to the people who had loved her most. "I got him, Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking in the cemetery silence. "I destroyed the family that killed you. The Voss Empire is finished. Their money will help good people now, instead of buying corruption." The wind rustled through the oak leaves above her, carrying the scent of spring flowers and fresh earth. She had expected to feel triumph in this moment, the satisfaction of justice finally served. Instead, she felt only the crushing weight of what her revenge had cost. "But I fell in love with him," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "The son of your killer became the love of my life, and I had to choose between you and him. I chose you, Dad. I chose justice, but it killed him, and now it's killing me." She pulled the vial from her purse, holding it up to catch the dying sunlight. The pills inside looked so innocuous, so small to carry the power of ending everything. Death in a bottle, prescribed for animals too broken to heal. "Mom, I know you understand. When Dad died, you couldn't find a reason to keep living. I watched you fade away, day by day, until there was nothing left but grief wearing your face. I'm sorry I judged you for giving up. I understand now." The cemetery was empty except for a groundskeeper working near the entrance, too far away to notice one more mourner among the headstones. Elara unscrewed the vial's cap with trembling fingers, the pills rattling like dice in her palm. She thought of Damien in his final days, alone in a cell with only memories of their stolen moments together. She thought of his smile in the courtroom, that gentle, understanding expression that had haunted her dreams for months. She thought of his final letter, asking her to live well, to write their story, to show the world that love was possible even in the midst of war. "I tried," she whispered to his memory. "I tried to live with what we did to each other. But love isn't supposed to require destroying the person you care about most. Justice isn't supposed to feel like damnation. I can't carry this anymore." The pills were bitter on her tongue, washing down with the bottled water she'd brought for this purpose. She lay back on the grass between her parents' graves, staring up through the oak branches at the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The physical effects began within minutes: a gentle drowsiness, a slowing of her racing thoughts, a gradual loosening of the guilt that had been strangling her for months. But as her body began to shut down, her mind filled with memories of love instead of revenge. Damien's hands gentle on her face the night he first kissed her, his laughter when she beat him at cards, his tears in her arms after his father's funeral, the way he looked at her as if she were something precious instead of the weapon that would destroy him. "We could have been happy," she murmured to the stars. "In another life, in another world. We could have saved each other instead of destroying everything we touched. The groundskeeper would find her body the next morning, peaceful beneath the oak tree with her parents' names carved in stone beside her. The media would call it a tragic end to a story of corruption and justice. They would never understand that it was really a love story, the tale of two people who found each other across an impossible divide, who chose to love completely, even when love demanded everything they had to give. Her final thought, as consciousness faded like the last light of sunset, was of Damien's voice from their last phone conversation. Forever is all we have now. Forever, she realized, was enough. Forever was where they could love each other without betrayal, without the weight of justice and revenge, without the burden of being enemies who had found grace in each other's arms. Forever was where they could finally be free. The stars watched over her as she joined the man she had loved and destroyed, their story complete at last, in the only way it could be, with sacrifice, with love, with the understanding that some kinds of devotion are too powerful for a world built on the necessity of choosing sides. In death, they found what had been impossible in life: a love without conditions, without consequences, without the cruel mathematics of justice that demanded payment in blood and heartbreak. Forever, as promised, was all they needed. Sometimes love isn't enough to heal what hatred has broken. Sometimes we become exactly what fate made us, two broken people who destroyed everything we touched, including each other. My family, if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that broken things can be made whole again. Subscribe for more stories of love, and comment below with your own second chance story. You are loved, you are worthy, and your story matters too.